So thank you
Okay.
very much. I'm good to go.
Okay, good. And put all my notes right where I can see them. Make sure I have my glasses so I can see my notes. Okay. All righty. Here we go. And we are recording. 3, 2, 1. Hello and welcome to Earth911's Sustainability in Your Ear. This is an innovator interview, and we're talking today with Beth Porter, the author of Reduce, Reuse, Reimagine, Sorting Out the Recycling System, a great new book just out. Beth, welcome to the show. Glad to have you.
Thank you so much for having me on.
Well, you know, I read your book over the past week. Thanks for sending the review copy. You start off with a story that I remember my parents telling me about World War II recycling and how the entire country pulled together. What happened when we were doing scrap recycling in the 1940s?
Absolutely. I thought this was a very important place to start because from what I could tell, it's the last time in our modern history that the country is really unified around areas that are essentially conservation efforts. And while I myself was not alive to participate in the scrap drives, reading accounts through a lot of news articles from the time, and then of course, historians who have covered this era, I was really struck by how much of a community effort this was and how people really rallied behind the scrap drives. It was, I want to say it's in the book, but I believe it was in Nebraska, apologies. It was in Nebraska where an editor of a newspaper saw an article that the reporter had written about how the troops overseas needed more supplies, and there was a big constraint there. And that launched what ended up being the Nebraska Scrap Drive. And the response to the scrap drive was so overwhelming that it ended up launching a national movement. And so it was really just, one reporter saying that there was a need, someone having the idea and a call to action, and the community rallied in an unbelievable way. And I think that all of these conservation efforts are so inspiring, but I always wonder, how do we harness that energy across the country for the environment instead of for the war effort? And I think some of the challenges that are pretty apparent to me of the differences, which is there's a certain end date. A lot of folks are willing to do with less or do without if they know that there's a chance for prosperity at the end. And I think that the idea to tell folks to change their habits now, to reduce consumption and improve those daily choices that we make, it's a challenge for folks to not know. Oh, that's okay.
We'll back up because my dog barked.
Oh, no problem.
She really shouldn't have done that. So if we could just back up to, my dog barked and I spaced.
Oh, that's okay. That's okay.
So let's back up to discussing. So you said moving from a war effort to an environmental effort. And I think that's a good place to restart.
Okay, great. So what I've always wondered is, how do we harness that kind of energy and instead of for a war effort, use it for an environmental effort? And I think where the challenge is that in World War II, there was a certain kind of end date. Folks are very willing to do without and do with less if they know that there's prosperity coming around the corner once the war is over. And so I think we have a challenge today to encourage folks to do that, but for environmental protection, for curbing climate change, for protecting communities. There are many powerful calls to action, but it does require a more long-term change of habits. So trying to help folks see that the importance and the urgency is still there, but that we need to kind of transform how we're operating as a society.
Well, and that's exactly it. We are transforming in response to something that is much more amorphous than the Axis threat. The other thing about a war is that you can speed the end date. You hope to win earlier, and I think that was one of the motivations. And the thing that I recall hearing is that kids in particular took pride in contributing to the war effort, but I believe kids today are, based on the surveying, as concerned about the environment. Is this simply a matter of activating a new, younger set of generations and motivating them the right way?
I think that's a really excellent point. You know, just today, in fact, there were, I think, nearly 200 young people camped outside of Nancy Pelosi's office, urging them to create a committee to sign a new Green Deal to promote green jobs and tackling climate change. So I think, you know, there are all sorts of examples like this, particularly this year in response to we're seeing intensifying storms. It's really terrifying and infuriating, I think, for young people to know that they're going to have to deal with the harshest, most severe effects of climate change, while many of those who are okay with continuing on with business as usual may not be present for those effects. And so I think there is a huge, powerful energy in the youth climate movement right now, definitely.
So in the United States, and you're right that we have about 94% of Americans have access to a recycling program now, but we seem stuck at around 30 to 34% in recycling. What do you think the pushes needed are, particularly since we're talking about a younger generation who can change the way everything works given 10 years?
Absolutely. I think that we need to revisit reduce, reuse, recycle, and note that when we practice it as a hierarchy, it's not just kind of, you know, a cute, charming saying from the 90s where we try to, you know, be green and save the world. It is a fundamental transformation of how we use resources as a society. So when we see not only individuals practicing the 3 Rs, but we see supply chains, businesses and corporations, government entities, when that's being used, we see a huge shift in the amount of resources we're using, reusing materials more creatively and efficiently, and of course, supporting a stronger recycling system for, you know, a closed loop way to dispose of our waste when we do need to dispose of it. So I think that there's a lot just to use in recharging that phrase and that sentiment and helping people understand that it's written that way for a reason. Reduce comes first for a reason. And it's a very powerful concept when we apply it at multiple levels, rather than just focusing on residents and individuals. When you look at all the stakeholders in the system, it can be really transformative.
Yeah, you know, I've even found with climate deniers that once they figure out that there is actually a living to be made in this business, they suddenly don't deny us as much.
That's exactly right. And I found it's really interesting, but recycling is a pretty bipartisan issue. I've talked with folks from very deeply red parts of the country and deeply blue parts of the country, and they're extremely, you know, the same passion about recycling is reflected. And so I think it's very interesting to me that this concept goes across the political spectrum. And so it could really be a doorway of conversation for how do we tackle, okay, we talk about material waste, then what about energy waste and clean energy and the jobs associated with that, and really a bridge to start those very important explorations.
Well, there's so much information that people need to know, but you also provide a number of examples of organizations that provided the information locally and then catalyzed change. And I think one of the most interesting was Chicago's Resource Center, which was long in the 1970s, become a community-driven recycling powerhouse, essentially. Tell us how that happened and what did they get right?
Yeah, I would love to defer to the Resource Center Chicago for obviously its own history, because I'm not super well versed in the depths of their background. But from the research I've read, Ken Dunn started this facility to fill a need in the community to deal with waste. And as we've learned through Dr. Robert Bullard's research and a lot of the undeniable research, there is a lot of pressure put on certain communities, typically communities of color, lower income communities that lack a lot of the political power that wealthier white communities have, to push back against very unhealthy forms of waste disposal. So a lot of communities have been receiving, you know, this landfills, incinerators, all sorts of potentially very damaging disposal sites in their communities. And I think Chicago is another example of that. And the Resource Center began to help educate folks about resources and the way we use them, and to offer a drop-off for recycling services and to emphasize the reduce, reuse, recycle. And it also looked at what was unique in the community and took a lot of materials to start building in what's called, I believe, brownfields. So areas in cities that are, lots that have been abandoned, essentially, building really productive, awesome things like gardens and turning those into green spaces to not only just help with a responsible way to discard our resources, but also to look and see how these materials could be used within the city itself to help make it a more greener, healthier, positive environment for the folks that live there. And I think it was a really, phenomenal endeavor.
Well, it really struck me as an example of how even one person, Ken Dunn's initiative, can change an entire city. And of course, it becomes a model for others. Let's talk about a more recent example of an emerging model, and that is mandatory recycling. You talk about Vermont's universal recycling mandate. How does that stack up as a model in your mind?
I think that Vermont is a really interesting example. And of course, a lot has changed in just the last few months across the board with recycling as we're struggling to navigate the national sword policy from China. But Vermont is a state that had not seen a lot of changes in its own recycling rate, much like the rest of the country, just kind of stagnated at a certain level. And this mandate is a very powerful and ambitious one because it comes in over a phase of a few years and it targets different kinds of materials. So I believe the full rollout would have happened in 2020, although now there have been a few changes and delays on that to navigate the national sword policy. But it would culminate in 2020 by banning all organic and food waste from the landfill. So, starting with things like banning paper products from the landfill, metal items, and these landfill bans or recycling mandates, whichever term you'd want to use, are used across a few different states. Vermont is one that has decided to scale it up and do a wide range of not just the borderline recyclables, but ambitiously tackle an organics diversion rate as well. So I think it's a really fantastic goal, but it's paired with an interesting thing. When you have a recycling mandate in a state, sometimes that can actually put the burden on the waste hauler who's transporting the goods from a landfill, and then they have to reroute it to recycling. So how do you get the individuals and residents to participate? And Vermont has employed a pay-as-you-throw program, which is, as I'm sure you definitely know, and many of your listeners probably know, where you pay for what you throw away, essentially. And there are different mechanics that different communities use, but Vermont uses that to also help discourage folks just throwing things in the trash and to actually engage in this recycling system. And so they have seen some improvements in just the first year or two of this being phased in. They started to see some upward movements in the amount of waste that was recycled or rerouted from food waste into donation centers and food pantries for food that was still good for folks to eat. So there have been a lot of positive changes from it.
Yeah, the 40% redirection of food waste that they reported was really striking because that's such a big problem. Now, the pay-as-you-throw model is interesting, and it expresses itself in a lot of different ways, but it goes part and parcel with the idea of just thinking about what you're buying, what you're throwing away, and what you're recycling. Now, your book is also pretty critical of what we call the single-stream recycling system, the big blue bin of hope that people often throw stuff in that is not recyclable, and as a result creates a lot of contamination. If we could get consumers to sort better at the edge of the network at their home, at the curbside, how would that change the need for sorting in the recycling system, and in particular the massive facilities we call materials recovery facilities, or MRFs?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, single stream is it's a really massive challenge in the industry right now. And as I note in the book, ironically, I think the Waste Management, which is one of the biggest waste companies in the country, launched the first single stream program in California in the 90s and has since been trying to deal with the effects of single stream, which is increased contamination across the board. So I think that single stream has caused a lot of problems for us, and one being that it takes a lot of the mindfulness out of dealing with our waste. And I don't want recycling for waste management to be inaccessible for folks, but I don't want it to be mindless either. I want it to be accessible, understandable, but I still think it's important that we have people thinking about what they're throwing away and what away means. And so sorting can be a good mechanism of helping people stay engaged with their waste. And I don't think we're going to see a huge trend of turning back from single stream recycling. Some municipalities have been dabbling in the idea because of the China policy, thinking, oh, well, maybe dual stream, which is when we sort, for example, paper out of the rest of the materials, or multi-stream is something to look at to get those recoverable, high quality commodities for sale. But I think in some ways it's the cat's out of the bag with single stream because it is so widespread throughout our country. So what I try to do in the book is help people understand these complex MRFs, as you mentioned, which is just, a sea of different machines and manual sorting, conveyor belts, and how to understand what's going on behind the curtain there to help make decisions with how we recycle items. So yeah, I do think single stream is here to stay for at least the foreseeable future.
I think one of the interesting things, and we've had a couple of companies on, most recently RTS, which is using sort of an Uber model to coordinate haulers in the New York and Philadelphia areas. Now that we have new distributed intelligence systems that can allow us to coordinate the delivery of stuff to the right recycler, it seems to me that what we can stop doing is thinking about the value being gone when something is finished with its life or thrown away. I mean, we think, oh, it's gone now, I threw it away. But in fact, that you put out value that somebody can recover. And it strikes me that we have an opportunity to incent people to go back and do what they were doing in World War II, which is start to pick up and recycle or find solutions that help other people recycle better. You talk about at the end of the book, joyful acts of sustainability. How can we catalyze that conversation and find possibly even new jobs for people, helping to make a clean environment?
Yeah, that's a great point. For me, ending the note on hopefully hopeful
I thought so.
is important, because I think a lot of the conversation around sustainability and the environmental movement, and I've certainly been a part of this as well, of creating content that promotes a lot of urgency, but in that effort to drive urgency, there is a lot of somber, there's a lot of burden, there's a lot of shaming that can happen with individuals where we talk about what humans have done so horribly wrong. And I don't think we should avoid talking about that, but we need to also encourage people to take part in this movement in whatever way that looks like for them, because different people have different skill sets, and there's no one way to be an environmentalist. And I want to make it a more accessible movement for folks to see themselves in it, because we're all in the environmental movement, whether we like it or not. It's just about how we participate in it and how we use our own skill sets, our own platforms and channels to steer the direction towards more sustainability. And I don't think that always has to be a burdensome, scary, intimidating task. It can be something that people find a lot of creativity and joy and excitement in, to find solutions. It feels really good to be self-sufficient, find a solution for something. And a great example of how we channel that into job growth, I think, is in the repair industry.
Yeah.
Looking at ways to creatively reuse and repair items. And if we have individuals and businesses pushing for more models that allow products to go from, the planned obsolescence of use it once, throw it out, or iPhones that start breaking down after a year or two, to really try and reform that to include more possibilities for repair, build products that are made to be repairable again. It's a big, tall task, because there's been our economy was jump-started after the war, which I talk about in the book, in large part by the need to drive consumption and push for single-use items. And so it's really turning back, getting us back before that era that we need to do. And I think a lot of that comes from the excitement and self-sufficiency that can come from repairing an item. Repairing something makes something brand new again. And if we're putting more effort and energy and demand behind more opportunities to reuse and repair things, there's a lot of job potential there. There are a lot of folks with there's a lot of chances to grow trades in repairing these items. And so that's certainly part of the Reimagine part of the book is imagine what that would look like when we don't just throw something away, when we know that we have something within our community that's an accessible way to have it repaired and make it feel new again to us.
Well, and with recirculation, the other opportunity for people to make some money is to actually be the market itself and do the marketing of things that have been repaired or that could be reused in different ways. So I see a lot of opportunity, and your book is a great inspiration to start thinking this through. So I encourage everybody to go out and buy and read, reduce, reuse, reimagine, and then of course give it to a friend.
Yes, thank you.
It will help us sort out the recycling system. Beth, you're at bethrecycles.com. And
That's right.
Is that the best place to keep track of you?
That's a great place to keep track of me. And folks can also contact me. I love answering people's questions about recycling, or if you want to share stories from your own community, that's a great way to reach me, and then also find out more about the book.
Thank you very much for joining us today, Beth. We look forward to talking to you again someday.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Mitch.
Well, folks, that's Beth Porter, the author of Reduce, Reuse, Reimagine Out the Recycling System. I encourage you to go out and buy the book today. It is out, isn't it?
Yes, it is. It actually goes out on Amazon in 2 days, but you can go ahead and start ordering it through your local bookstore or buy it directly through my website, and there are ways to do that. So it's had a rolling out of a release date. And there's also an audiobook too for folks that would prefer that option.
Oh, great. On Audible?
It is on Audible, yes.
Congratulations.
Thank you.
I was one of their first content producers. So.
Wow, that's fantastic.
So everybody jump in and read the book. Thanks very much for joining us today on Sustainability in Your Ear. This innovator interview will be back again with another one soon. Everybody have a great day. And that's it.
Wonderful. That was fantastic. Thank you. That was